Welcome to the Content Amplified podcast, brought to you by Masset. Our goal is to help you get more from your marketing content. Each episode is a 10 to 15 minute interview with industry experts that share amazing insights to help you squeeze as much juice from your content as you possibly can. Here's today's interview.
Welcome back to another episode of Content Amplified. Today I'm joined by John. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ben. Excited to be here.
So John is joining us from, would you call it upstate, west state, New York? How do you define that geographic region?
Yeah, no, that's the battle, right? I think people in the Adirondacks, they would claim upstate New York. I live in what is generally called Western New York, in a little village between Rochester and Buffalo.
John, before we dive in, maybe just share a little bit about your background and kind of some of your passions in marketing so we can kind of set the stage for today's conversation.
Yeah, like I said, I'm John Baker, live in the middle of nowhere in Western New York. I have a wife and 4 kids. And yeah, in terms of marketing, what I enjoy, I guess you could say it's a little bit of everything. I've kind of been that guy who wears a lot of hats. I've often worked in really small software companies. The reason I kind of got into these small startup SaaS companies was because I originally worked for a large multinational industrial manufacturing company. And I spent most of my marketing days there updating sales brochures in InDesign and talking to trade press about how to put pipe fittings into magazine layout. I hated it, every minute of it. It was awful. And so I said, I'm going to go the opposite direction. I'm going to find something that's exciting, that's fast moving. And there was a local software company in Rochester, New York. I think I was hire number 11. Yeah, I've been kind of working there ever since. But by nature of working with those small organizations, it means that they're often just looking for someone who's kind of hired as a marketing figure it out guy. You know, with startups, you don't have a lot of structure, you don't have a lot of processes in place. And they're really looking for the people who can kind of come in and institute those processes. And so it started out with just kind of broadly content. And so a lot of it was writing, took a little bit of that InDesign magic and started doing some layout for ebooks. And that eventually turned into more broad content applications, started going into social media, started going into video. And today it's just more of doing whatever needs to get done over the course of a day.
I love it. So today we're going to talk about SEO. Some foundational stuff, a lot of different areas of SEO and how to optimize your content for SEO and get the most out of it. And some really cool ways to kind of get more data to kind of help your SEO and do some of that kind of stuff than the traditional SEO purist might tell you. So John, how did you first get into SEO? How did you kind of start learning about that subject and learning more about how to rank on Google?
Well, I was dragged unwillingly into the world of SEO by my own curiosity. Like I said, working at a small company. And originally, my responsibilities were mostly just write good things about the software product. And so that's kind of how it started out. But I would often feel a sense of frustration because I would write something, I would publish it, and then I move on to the next piece. You know, that's how it is for writers. And some people are super happy with that. They just like nose to the grindstone, focus on their writing, and just work on their craft. But by nature of being curious, I always kind of wanted to know how are things performing. And so I sat next to the marketing ops guy, and I was always asking him questions. And I was like, how did this perform? How did that do? Did we get anything from this? And I think probably just out of pure frustration one day, he was like, you know what? You need answers. Here's Google Analytics. Go wild. And so that was kind of my introduction to SEO. Was I just was curious about how are the things that I was writing? How are they performing? And so I started paying attention to really all that was there to learn from the behaviors of these anonymous individuals who are finding themselves on our websites, trying to figure out what are the things that work, what are the things that don't, and try to use that to inform the decision making going forward with the content planning.
So you kind of had this self-guided journey into SEO. If someone is also right there on the precipice of saying, shoot, I need to learn it, what are some like your initial recommendations for someone to get started?
I think my initial recommendations are really just to jump in. There are so many resources out there, and it's going to be kind of overwhelming if you're the kind of person who likes to feel like you have a really good grasp of something before you try it. I would say you're probably going to get a little bit frustrated because if you go out there, you read the resources, you'll feel like you are You're never going to know enough. It's kind of like parenting. So I can say this because I have kids, but if someone else said this, I'd probably be offended. But yeah, SEO is like kids where you're never really ready. You just got to go do it and you'll figure it out along the way. And you're going to be really bad at it for a little bit of time. But through the process of kind of chasing and pursuing your own curiosity and trying to get the answers to those questions, you're going to be a better, whatever it might be. It might be video production, might be a writer, just by taking the time and paying attention to what SEO has to offer, you're going to be a better version of that content marketer as a result of that pursuit.
That's great. So SEO, especially now with AI and everything going on, it changes all the time. Like that's the extra frustrating piece. You're like, okay, I've got a grasp on it. And then all of a sudden you're like, hey, I don't rank for anything anymore, or something happened. How do you recommend people stay on top of SEO and constantly learn more about how to get their content to perform, even though things are constantly changing in the landscape?
I mean, there's a lot of stuff kind of embedded in that question there. I would say generally, if it's about trying to get a feel for the future direction of SEO, I think part of it is just about being self-aware. How do you engage with media? What things do you go to Google for versus what things would you go to TikTok or YouTube or some other platform for versus where would you go to crowdsourced information like Reddit? And just pay attention to where you're more likely to do those things. And also just talk to other people, ask questions, be curious, and lean into that. So that means having conversations, sometimes unsolicited, with people and just ask them, hey, how do you go about figuring this thing out? One thing we were talking about earlier was understanding kind of who your ICP is, who your ideal customer profile is, picking out those people, and then actually meeting those people in like the flesh, very IRL, old school, and just ask them questions. And don't let it be annoying questions about your brand. Ask them like genuinely about how do you interact with this crazy world that we call the internet, and just try to learn as much as you can through those interactions. So that's one of the big ones. In terms of more broadly, you were talking about like, hey, I woke up this morning and our organic traffic dropped 20%. The thing that nobody wants to admit is that that is absolutely going to happen to everybody at some point. Sometimes it'll recover, sometimes it won't. And then sometimes you'll see a 20% shot in the opposite direction overnight. And that's kind of part of the game that we play when we're operating with the the monster that is Google. I used to joke with friends, be like, if you want to rank for something, you have to make your sacrifice at the altar of Google and, figure out exactly how many turtle doves and chickens you have to sacrifice. Because it really does feel almost religious at times. You're just like, I'm not really sure. Algorithms are changing. Do the best I can, try to get those backlinks, try to follow these best practices with keyword and just see how it goes. So a lot of it is just about testing, talking to other SEO professionals. I spend a lot of time on Reddit talking to other SEO professionals and just seeing like, hey, what are you seeing on your backend analytics? And sometimes you'll feel like my site is falling apart overnight, but everyone's is, and you might see a restoration of that over time. So a lot of it is just about being curious and talking to people.
Yeah, I think that's great. So I have a bunch of buddies who all drove motorcycles back in college. And every single person I've met that rides a motorcycle, it's not about if you're going to lay your bike down. It's about when you're going to lay your bike down and if you're going to do it safe. And that was kind of the mentality. And I think it's true with SEO, like you're talking about. It's not a matter of if you can avoid some massive change in traffic. It's a matter of when it happens and figuring out how to fix it and learning from other people. So one thing that was cool that you also talked about, there's a lot of good online resources. When you're looking at SEO, you're looking at Keyword Planner, Ahrefs, SEMrush and all that kind of stuff. And it'll give you some good data, but you really firmly believe in also collecting first party data. And you shared a story beforehand about like a soccer game. Do you mind sharing that story? Because I think this is like a golden example of how do I collect first party data to understand the mindset of my audience, because it goes beyond the SEO. Obviously, if I could rank for this, that's great. But is it even the right thing to rank for? Is this where they want to consume their information? Is it a waste of time? I think this story really illustrates, an awesome point.
I got a lot of kids. They play soccer. I tricked them into that through my soccer fandom. They're all doing their practices at like different fields at the same time. I had 3 kids all on different fields. And so I'm head on a swivel trying to pay attention to all of them, trying to applaud when they all get a goal or just don't fall on their face trying to kick the ball. And so I'm there, and there's another dad who's there standing next to me, and his daughter is on the same team as my daughter. So I start talking to him. I'm like, hey, what do you do? And he tells me basically he is my ICP in the flesh. I didn't talk about my company specifically, but I told him, I was like, oh, it's really interesting. Here's some of the things that I do with my daily work. And a lot of it is just about trying to better understand. And so I start talking to him like, where do you go when you want to be a better version of your job? This guy worked in IT. It's like, where do you go to learn about that? If maybe you want to advance your career, what are the resources you go to? What are the publications you read for fun, even? We start asking these questions. And then one of the questions I asked him was specifically around language that we use a lot within our company, which is we talk about SaaS because we are a SaaS management platform for IT professionals. And so I started talking about SaaS, and he said something there that I had a tiny little existential crisis. Nobody calls it SaaS. He's like, that's vendor talk. We just call them applications. We call them business apps and things like that. And it was just that little comment. He said that, and it made me recognize of how much time I've spent in the echo chamber within the company, where we'll all talk about SaaS because we are the vendor, and so that's the language we use. But that is really just like business speak for the delivery mechanism for the software. But from his perspective, it's applications. They're dealing with applications. And so just because of that tiny little conversation, the next time I go to do some keyword research about something, maybe a long tail keyword where I would intuitively put SaaS in that, I'm also checking and swapping it out with applications, business applications, using those kind of terms. And it really expands the scope, and you can find those kind of the language opportunities that different ways to kind of beat out your competitors, and you'll find opportunities that have much lower keyword difficulty with comparable or even better search volume. So it's just kind of like a microcosm of what we should be doing all the time, but we often don't because we kind of become blind.
Yeah, for sure. Speaking of language, so I lived in Germany for a couple years, learned how to speak German, and everyone learns how to speak what's called Hochdeutsch or High Deutsch or High German. And what's funny though is everywhere you go, they all speak different kind of versions of German, depending on how far south and where you go. Everyone understands Hochdeutsch. But if you don't speak in the right kind of slang or dialect for the city, they know you don't belong, even if they can still understand you. And I think it's super applicable to how we do business. I would be willing to bet every single industry has the exact same problem of how do I use the right terminology for my business? You're constantly trying to redefine your category and your businesses. You're trying to stand out and look and feel different. But really, like when it comes down to it, if your customers are not talking about you that way, there's a disconnect, and they may understand what you're trying to say, but it doesn't resonate sometimes. Even before, when we were talking on this, just before we joined the podcast, I had a question. What are your thoughts about gated? Like I use the term gated, and for people in marketing content, you instantly know what someone's talking about. But if out of context, like if my wife overheard me, so what are you talking about gates for? Like what in the world does that mean? But it's like that unique language where if you're in a post and you just refer to gated content, everyone gets it if they're in that space. And if they're not, they don't. Okay. I promised it would go by quick. We're already 15 minutes into it. So thank you so much for your time and for sharing all of that. It was so good. John, if anyone wants to continue the conversation with you, how do they reach out and connect online?
Ben, this was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me on the podcast. I really do appreciate it. And you also didn't tell me when I suggested SEO that you were actually an SEO expert in the past. So,
in a former life, there are far better people than me. So,
but yeah, so people, I'd love to kind of continue this conversation, or if anybody has any further questions about it, happy to answer those. You can find me on LinkedIn, John Baker, one of the many. I work for my company is called Tori, and we're a SaaS management platform that helps IT professionals find out how many unsanctioned business applications they've got within their SaaS stack. So hopefully with all that information, you can find me out there somewhere.
I'm sure you have some sweet, sweet stories about just how many unsanctioned pieces of software are going on in a business.
You get some brutal horror stories from IT pros when they first plug it in and they see how many unsanctioned apps are in that company.
I love it. That's awesome. All right, John, thank you for the time. We'll make sure we link to you in the show notes to make sure people can find you from all the other John Bakers. And awesome. Thanks so much for your time. And hopefully we have you back on the podcast sometime.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Content Amplified podcast. Please subscribe and leave us a review. And for additional ways to get more out of your content, visit our website at getmasset.com. That's getmasset.com. And tune in next time to the Content Amplified podcast.